Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast. Conversations with today's top ministry leaders to help you lead better every day. And now, podcasting from the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center in Chicagoland, here are your hosts, Ed Stetzer and Daniel Yang.
Welcome to the Stetzer Church Leaders Podcast, where we're helping Christian leaders navigate and lead through the cultural issues of our day. My name's Daniel Yang.
Cultural issue today.
The cultural issues of the day. We'll get to that. Daniel Yang, the director of the Senate Institute, and we're excited to have with us today Todd Miles. Todd is a professor of theology at Western Seminary in Portland, Oregon, where he teaches theology, church history, hermeneutics, and ethics. Prior to becoming a seminary professor, he was also a nuclear engineer at Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Todd's latest book is Cannabis and the Christian: What the Bible Says About Marijuana. But before we hear from Todd, let's go to our host, editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine and executive director of Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, Ed Stetzer.
So Todd's writing about cannabis is for the Christian. So we're excited about having that conversation today. Okay, not really. And all the verses in the Bible that talk about this. You know, Second Opinions, chapter 4, verse 11. We're going to be talking about the doobie today. Actually, I taught my kids the word doobie from a Saturday Night Live skit, because, you know, I often make the joke that I'm a motivational speaker living in a van down the river. So my daughter, I forget which one, the middle one, I think, watches the skit, because I'm always making this joke. And she says, "So what's doobie?" Because he says, "You kids are smoking the doobie," you know, et cetera, et cetera. So we're going to talk about the doobie today, even though no one's called it that since the 70s. But we're going to talk about weed, marijuana. I'm trying to come up with all the slang.
Mary Jane. Roll a blunt.
You know this slang a little better than you should.
Well, yeah.
You weren't always a follower of Jesus. But that's what we're going to talk about, is what does it mean today? Because we're just seeing widespread legalization. We're in Illinois, where weed is legal. Our guest is in Oregon, where I think it's legal. I don't really know because I don't purchase it. But a lot of people are asking the question, and what now? And this is what we're going to talk about today. So let's start with an obvious question. We've already introduced Todd. Obvious question is, you write a book on what the Bible says about marijuana. The Bible doesn't mention marijuana. So the question is, why start there? Tell us a little bit of the background.
Yeah, well, the background is very pastoral. Right after marijuana was legalized in Washington, it felt like the day after. We had a person in our congregation at the church that I serve as an elder at Hinson Baptist Church here in Portland, Oregon. We had a member of our church come to us and say, "Hey, now that marijuana is legal in Washington, recreational marijuana legal in Washington, would it be okay if I went across the river to smoke some pot?" And we realized that the normal back pocket answer no longer obtained, which was, "No, of course you can't. It's illegal." And we had to, dare I say, start thinking like Christians for a change, and try to mine the scriptures, which we understand to be sufficient. We have all the divine words that we need in order to live faithfully before God, to mine them for any wisdom that would pertain to this, and that was really how the book came about.
Yeah, we want to jump to the end and get the answer, but I think it's probably worth kind of thinking through, because, one of the things we have to also recognize is that Christians have had changing views on mind-altering substances. Is that when it comes to alcohol, really depending on your denominational tradition, if your denominational tradition came out of the Second Great Awakening, which is tied into the temperance movement time-wise, Wesleyans, Pentecostals, Baptists, you're probably anti-alcohol, and just naturally probably anti-marijuana. But then the question is what if you predate that? What if you're, everyone quotes Luther's comments about alcohol and more. So how do we begin to think about alcohol and marijuana? Do we think of them in the same way? Do we think of them differently? Help unpack some of that for us.
Well, it probably will not work just to substitute the word marijuana every time we see the word wine, right? For a couple of reasons. One, wine is celebrated in the scriptures and is part of the ritual worship of God throughout the Old Testament and in the New Testament with the Lord's Supper. It would be a very strange Lord's Supper service, wouldn't it, if we substituted the word wine or marijuana for wine?
I'm not saying that's a good idea, but it does sound more like it could be. Some people, I'm opposed to that, but go ahead.
Okay, all right. But the second and probably most important reason is that marijuana and alcohol are very different in significant ways. And so if we're going to apply biblical prohibitions on, say, drunkenness, which is where the concern would lie with alcohol, then we need to know how marijuana actually works. before we can just kind of blindly start substituting biblical prohibitions on it. And that's what I endeavored to do in the book, was to take a little bit of a dive into how marijuana actually works, how it affects the mind, and then be able to hopefully apply faithfully the biblical wisdom that the Lord has given us.
You already said you can't really easily swap out marijuana for alcohol in the passages in Scripture, but can you highlight some of the passages, especially the ones that you use in the book, to talk about how we can think about marijuana, whether to permit it or not permit it?
Yeah. Well, helpfully, the Lord does not just say, "Don't get drunk," and then with the reason being, because I said so. He could have done that because he's God. Right? He could have done it. But instead, the scriptures are full, not just of prohibitions on drunkenness, but explanations as to why it's unwise and sinful to get intoxicated. I categorize them in three ways. One is that drunkenness impairs you physically, it impairs you cognitively, and it impairs your moral judgment. And marijuana intoxication demonstrably does all three of those things. And so I'm pretty comfortable at that point saying, okay, biblical prohibitions on alcohol intoxication would also apply to intoxication by recreational marijuana.
Okay, so part of the conversation we hear from people, I want to walk through this well. I want to fully inhale the question and the conversation here. Sorry, this is just, I don't even know. We're going to get letters. But part of the conversation is that, okay, I mean, people are, if they do get high from doing marijuana, that becomes a calming thing for them. Many people will say this, I get anxious. I hear this regularly. I get anxious. Taking marijuana reduces that. Now, in the book, you do distinguish. You talk about medical marijuana and otherwise, but what if people are saying this is something I'm doing, like Paul says, have a little wine, after supper. I'm doing this at nighttime to help calm myself down. What's the matter with that?
Yeah, well, it could be perhaps nothing, but I think as like a leader in the church, I would want to know why. I do think that there are different questions that need to be asked about medical marijuana than about recreational marijuana, although there is no difference in the substance. And I think that surprises a lot of people. I think a lot of people think, well, there's medical marijuana and then there's another substance entirely called recreational marijuana. That's not the case.
Actually, I was this many years old when I thought there was a difference between the two. So really, I didn't know that.
No, if you go into a dispensary with a medical marijuana card, if you're in a state that even requires such a thing, you will be buying from the same portions as the people who are standing in line just for the sake of getting high later that day.
Right.
So there's no difference there. And because of that, then all of the physical risks and all of the emotional and mental risks would still obtain for medical use. But you're right that there are a lot of people who self-medicate for anxiety, nerves, mood alteration, or even like for pain management, that sort of thing. And at that point, I would want to ask other questions because it is a mind-altering substance, and it's not easy following Jesus. Right? We battle the world, the flesh, and the devil. We are instructed to worship the Lord with our heart, our strength, our soul, our mind. And so I think we have to ask the question as followers of Christ, is taking a mind-altering substance, is that going to enable me to follow the Lord better? Is that going to aid in my taking every thought captive in obedience to Christ? Is that going to be a blessing or a hindrance to the kind of sober-mindedness that the New Testament writers especially advocate and command Christians to possess. So those are the kind of questions that I'd want to ask, and also, quite frankly, self-medication. Heavens, we do it all the time in terms of like Tylenol or Advil or maybe an allergy med or something like that. But I would be concerned if someone came to me and said, Todd, I have to drink alone every night just to calm my nerves a bit, because I don't think people should drink alone. And I don't say that just because I'm a Baptist. I just think that as leaders in the church, as a pastor in the church,
we shouldn't rush past that because I actually got that joke. But go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I don't think that this kind of self-medication with a mind-altering drug should be done in secret. That we should be open to accountability, and when a mind-altering substance is prescribed by a doctor, there's a kind of accountability there, right? Because it's been prescribed, dosage can be controlled, all of those sorts of things. But when people begin to self-medicate with mind-altering substance, which is what a lot of people do with marijuana, then you don't have that, even that first level of accountability, which is a doctor who's managing dosage for you. And so there's a host of wisdom and discipleship questions that I would want to ask.
I know that we're talking about the ethical dimension of it, and there's probably so much more to unpack, especially when we're talking about medical marijuana and how even some forms are being modified to have less of the effects that we're talking about there. But
that's what I thought. So that's why I was thinking the medical marijuana is different. I thought there was a sense that it was lessened, but it sounds like you can do it both ways.
You can. If you walked into a marijuana dispensary, you would find a wide range of THC percentages. Something very, very low, maybe 1.5%, 2%, something like that, on up into the 30s, which would be really, really, really high. And then you can always get wax or oils that will be double, so almost triple that.
So, sorry to interrupt you. Sorry.
No, it's good because you could talk about the ethical dimensions, but regardless of how you feel about the ethics of it, the practicality is that so many of our church pastors are going to have members that are. My sister, for instance, is a physician, and so her personal conviction is that she won't prescribe marijuana to her patients, but she'll refer them out. That's her personal preference. That's her conviction. But not everybody's going to be able to discern that for themselves. And so if you're a pastor and a church leader, how do you help your congregation work on a day-to-day basis when marijuana could be a reality for them? And then secondly is I've had conversations with pastors who their elders are getting into marijuana as a business, weed farms and weed stocks and those kinds of things. So how do we navigate those really practical conversations?
Oh, holy cow. So those were two really big questions right there.
They were.
Yeah. If you could just answer those in like 2 minutes or less, that'd be awesome.
Yeah.
Please.
So the short answer to the first question is, what do pastors need to do? I would say, well, first off, you could go buy my book, right?
There you
go buy the book where I've done a little bit of the lifting for you. You have to educate yourself as to how marijuana works, and then just do some advanced teaching on how mind-altering drugs intersect with the Christian life, if at all. And because the marijuana advocacy groups, even within the church, will argue things like it has all those great medical benefits. There's a whole Christian cannabis church sort of movement, which argues for a deepened relationship with Jesus. It'll take you to different levels and plateaus that you never thought imaginable before. And so I think some really good advanced work on this. What does the Bible actually say about what honors the Lord in our worship, about the nature of biblical meditation, about taking thoughts captive to Christ, about thinking well, honoring the Lord with our minds, that sort of thing. Briefly on the Christians getting involved in the cannabis industry. Well, I suppose it'd be the same kinds of questions that a person would have to ask about alcohol. There are certainly medical benefits to marijuana. I suspect it's such a highly complex plant that we have not even scratched the surface of what marijuana can do. There are some very helpful drugs that the FDA has already okayed that have been isolated and are now distributed by pharmaceutical companies for nausea, appetite enhancement. Those sorts of things are super valuable for people who are struggling with say, like the side effects of chemotherapy. There's a CBD based drug that the FDA has approved for very pernicious forms of childhood epilepsy that will mitigate seizures, that I think is just it's been a godsend for many. But the nice thing about those drugs is they have been isolated and are packaged and sold, and they are okayed by the FDA. And it's there was a lot of testing that went into that. And so I think with good conscience, with clear conscience, a Christian could use those drugs. A conscience issue may play into it, though. If someone just recommends, hey, why don't you go to a dispensary and get some pot so you can smoke it, that will help you with whatever certain malady that you have. There's a lot of different ways that people are cultivating marijuana for various different purposes. I'm not sure I have a one size fits all answer to that question, but probably starting out with, well, would it be okay to be involved in the alcohol industry? Would be a good start. And then start asking some of the other questions that marijuana might present that the alcohol answers don't suffice for.
Reminder to our listeners that Welch's grape juice was founded so that Methodists didn't have to have wine in communion. And right. It's interesting because it seems quaint today that that's the case. So I guess my question is probably predicated by a belief. I think probably in 10, 15 years from now, people are going to see marijuana like they see alcohol. And the idea of Christians sort of being against that will be a surprise to the culture. Just like when, people know certain Christians are anti-alcohol and some are more permissive towards alcohol. Do you see, am I wrong in thinking that this is just going to be mainstreamed in 10 years?
Oh, well, I think you're probably right, but let me give you some reasons that I think that's the case, and then some hopeful reasons why I think it's not. Right. Some reason I think it's the case is there is just a tidal wave that's sweeping across the country. It's just a matter of time. It's still a Schedule I drug, so is illegal at the federal level. I don't know how much longer that's going to last, and states are legalizing medical and then recreational at a very fast pace. I think as of today, like 17 states and the District of Columbia, recreational marijuana is legal. 33 states and District of Columbia, medical marijuana is legal as well. So in that sense, I think you're probably right. Here's why I'm hopeful that maybe we can put the brakes on this just a little bit. It's a little different from alcohol is in that it's not obvious to me that you can smoke a little bit recreationally just to enjoy some of the effects without getting intoxicated. I went into a dispensary to ask some questions in researching the book. They were super kind.
That's what you were just, it was just research. It was just research.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And I said, hey, this is kind of a dumb question probably, but I told him why I was asking the questions. And I said, is there any reason to smoke pot recreationally, other than to get high? And the lady just laughed at me. Like, no, there is no reason. Now, people self-medicate. And so, they will microdose to get a little bit of THC, which, you won't have any intoxicating effects, but they like how it helps them with some anxiety or mood. I think at that point, we're asking different kinds of questions, some different questions, but so there's enough risk involved that hopefully word will get out on this. So three quick things really fast. One is that there's a story out there that marijuana is not addictive. That's just patently false. It is absolutely addictive. Now, it's not as addictive as other substances, like alcohol or certainly opioids, but it is still addictive. About 1 in 10 adult users who smoke regularly, which would be 3 to 4 times a week, will develop a defined addiction to it where you are reshaping your brain and you're risking harm to self and others in order to meet that need. Second, underage marijuana use is just a terrible idea because THC demonstrably interferes with brain development. And it's not something you get back. It's not the kind of thing where you can stop smoking for a while and then your brain will catch up. If it interferes with your brain development, then you just don't get it back. And so people should think twice about smoking marijuana as when you're under 25 years old, because it takes that long, especially for the male brain to finish development. And then third, there's a growing amount of evidence that is linking mental illness, different kinds of psychotic behaviors and mental illnesses to marijuana use. Definitely, what I think is beyond question is there's a strong link between earlier onset of mental illness amongst those who are genetically predisposed towards mental illness. So it's just a terrible idea if you have any genetic predisposition towards mental illness, if it runs in your family, that to be smoking pot, or using THC products. And unfortunately, the message you get from the culture is almost the exact opposite. Oh, this is good for mental illness. Oh, this will calm you down. It certainly wouldn't lead to any kinds of psychotic behavior when that's demonstrably not the case by a growing body of evidence. So for those reasons, there's a lot to overcome, because certainly the culture is all into marijuana right now. The pop culture is, and the government seems to be walking in lockstep with that as well. So
yeah, it was interesting. Well, I don't know, what you're saying to me. I don't know these things. So I'm without the connection to mental illness and more. What I do remember is I was having a meeting with the Surgeon General and about another issue, and he just was like, "Oh, and by the way, as this tide towards legalizing marijuana, he echoed what you said. I think your second point was that he was not in favor of that, but he said, but if this happens, people need to know this on brain development. This is a substantive, significant problem, and again, the young brain is just at a different place in space. So again, hearing the cautions, appreciating the cautions." So how do we respond to, Christian cannabis? I mean, there's literally, you mentioned the churches, but it's, for me, I don't know that most pastors, leaders are, going to get up and publicly promote it, but it sort of happens. It's kind of like, you mentioned being a Baptist, right? So, and then you mentioned the joke about, drinking alone, but drinking is now largely and widely accepted in most churches, the Pentecostal, Wesleyan. The Wesleyans, until a few years ago, you couldn't be a full member of a Wesleyan church if you drank alcohol as a beverage. The clergy still can't, but most people sort of moved away and just kind of said, we're not going to talk about it so much. That kind of feels like how most people are dealing with marijuana, except maybe you. It's like, we're just going to talk about it as much and let people deal with it and decide on their own. Why is that not a good idea? Because obviously you wrote a book on it. Why is it not a good idea just to kind of say, you know what? I can't remember the last time I heard a sermon on alcohol in a church. And I've never heard a sermon on, I can think of a sermon on weed. Why talk about it? Well,
it's kind of funny. And just between us Baptists, I would say we really don't know how to drink. We're kind of stumbling our way through, whereas maybe some of the older denominations have been able to iron this out. But in so many instances,
I just want to personally say that I'm not stumbling my way through.
I
don't know what you're doing up in Portland, but I'm just not participating in that conversation. Yeah. But anyway, good deal. And by the way, it is funny because I've been watching Reels, like it's the grown up version of TikTok, and the big thing
on
is
Instagram.
On Instagram, it's like I keep telling myself, Joe, you got to quit drinking this week, and I'm just glad my name's not Joe. So I don't know why I'm getting all these alcohol things, and I actually don't drink, but it is interesting how this is a conversation. So come with me, or come back to it, and help me to see how we are not, and why are we not talking about it, why you are.
Well, I think one of the reasons we're not talking about it is, one, we've never had to talk about it, and so we don't really know what to say about it.
Fair.
I think that's the first reason. We have been able to lean on civil government for too long and just use that as our barometer, so to speak. our thermostat for what's right and what's wrong. And of course, that's just demonstrably a bad idea, as it's becoming more and more evident all the time. But certainly on this, just because the government says something is okay doesn't mean that it necessarily is. Second, I think there's an enormous pressure right now to not be legalistic. And that there's a lot of Christians who grew up in maybe a more legalistic context, and they just want to get as far away from that as possible. And so the last thing you want to do as a church pastor is to go give a bunch of rules for what to do and what not to do. Third, I think that there's such cultural pressure to advocate for marijuana. I mean, I don't know what it's like in Illinois, to say is where you're at, but in Oregon, it's almost as though people are proud of their marijuana use. And there's absolutely no stigma attached to it at all. You get more dirty looks for smoking tobacco than you would for smoking a joint in public.
Same here. Same here.
Yeah. And so why speak to something where you will just be perceived as hopelessly out of step? But there's so much at stake here. And, I don't want to come off as preachy or as judgmental or legalistic. I really try to treat marijuana use as a discipleship issue and a wisdom issue, except for intoxication. I do think intoxication is wrong. But how do we equip our church members? If you're a pastor, how do you equip your church members to think faithfully, to think biblically, to take every thought captive in obedience to Christ about something that is this significant? Because we're talking about a mind-altering substance, right? We're not talking about whether that extra Hershey bar is going to be good for me or bad for me, right? We are talking about something that could impair cognitive, physical abilities, but maybe most harmful moral judgment.
That's I think that's really helpful for our listeners to hear you say that, you shouldn't be legalistic about this, because many of them, as church leaders, some of the cases that they're having to deal with it really is case by case. So as we wrap up here, Todd, help the church leader, help the pastor think through like polity issues. Think through like at what point does somebody become too involved and you have to practice church discipline, or you have to intervene. So can you help us think through categories of how to apply, discipline or something like that?
Yeah. Well, drunkenness is clearly sinful. And so intoxication is wrong, and that would be a disciplinable offense, where you follow hopefully Matthew 18 to work with a person. Short of that, though, I would want to ask a series of questions. How does this intersect with your life as a follower of Jesus? And so this is going to require some accountability. It's going to require intentional discipleship, maybe like a deep discipleship, if with the a la JT English, and then ask the kind of questions of a person that you would ask of any sort of thing where they're playing with something that can get in the way of discipleship. So, is your use of recreational cannabis, is that going to enhance your ability to use your gifts? Right? As a fellow church member with all the other members of my church, it's in my best interest that everybody be on their A game. It's not in my best interest for people to be checked out in any way. That's the beauty of this interdependent organism called the church. I need my fellow brothers and sisters in Christ to be walking in communion with the Lord and then with me. I would ask questions about, is this going to aid or help your ability to take every thought captive in obedience to Christ? How is cannabis helping that? Is it possible that it's hindering that? And then, there's other kinds of discipleship questions like that. But I think that there's such a proclivity amongst us human beings to self-deception, that the more accountability that we can get, the more that we can bring things out into the open. Because without fail, whenever I go talk at a church, there's someone who says, no, you told me that being high impairs my physical abilities, it impairs my mental abilities. Hey, that is not true of me. And I've gotten to the point where I say, well, I can't argue with your
Sure.
experience, but I'm glad to meet the exception. Because we know physiologically what marijuana does and why it impairs cognitive abilities and physical abilities and all these other things. So I'm glad to meet the exception to the rule, the physiological anomaly. But chances are you're probably not that. You're probably deceiving yourself.
Fascinating. Okay, so for me, I've probably been pretty clear. I come from a family with deep issues with addiction. So one of the reasons I know myself and I avoid those things. So for me, it's kind of an easy answer, just because of the family history that goes back generations. My question for you would be, though, is it an agree to disagree in a local church, just like in some places, like I don't drink, but I recognize that people will be, and I'm, is that the place that we're going to end up, or is that the place you think we should end up, or is this something we should teach or preach as no? This is of a different kind of response. But make that a last question.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure that alcohol is simply an agree to disagree, because there's a responsible use for alcohol and there's an irresponsible use of alcohol. There's plenty of Bible that suggests that the irresponsible use of alcohol is absolutely sinful. And so at that level, I would say alcohol is not even an agree to disagree.
Let me just
go ahead.
I agree with you. It's a question of whether to participate at all. So I don't drink at all.
Yes.
Yet I'm in fellowship with people who do and recognize that they've made a different decision. So that's what I mean by agree to disagree.
Good. Yeah. And then beyond that, I think what we can't agree to disagree on is whether or not we're just going to ignore it and pretend that it's not a significant issue. And I don't think that we can agree to disagree on the necessity of discipleship and so many of the things that are vital to that. I don't think that we can agree to disagree on things like accountability in the Christian life. And so if there's an individual in your church who is insistent on using marijuana, but is not willing to talk about it with the leadership of the church or people who can hold them accountable, then at that point, I think we've crossed a line into, or we've crossed the line and are now in a place where some sort of pastoral intervention would be necessary. Certainly, we can't just ignore it, and we would be, I think, despising our congregations if we didn't teach people up on risks, on the discipleship issues that are inherent to an activity like marijuana consumption.
Okay, so I said last question, but I'm pressing on this a little more. So
that's okay.
Someone in the church comes to a different conclusion than you and I. And says, again, this is your answer. You're not answering for me and everybody else. So is that a Matthew 18 issue? Do I go to her? Do I go to him and confront that person in your view? Or that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is this a sin issue that needs to be confronted, any marijuana use outside of medical marijuana? Or is it something that, we come to a different conclusion? What are your thoughts?
Well,
and I'm pressing you, I know, but I want to press you. That's what
okay.
I do.
Well, since I wrote a book, I would want to go talk to a person on it because I'd want to know exactly what's going on. Since I am an elder at my church, and I do believe that Matthew 18 is not just limited to church leadership, but it's how we function as a body. I don't think there's any harm at all in going to a person and expressing concern over something. Now, if there is clear intoxication that is taking place, then I think you have very good grounds for going to a person and confronting them in the spirit of Matthew 18. And then if they're resistant to that, then I think you follow the steps, and eventually you have to get church leadership involved, probably sometime around the second step, or certainly before you get to the third step of that. So yeah, I would say that just ignoring the issue of marijuana use, I don't think will be helpful to anyone. And so I would encourage people to ask questions. And I know this feels and sounds hopelessly negative, so I'm even going to double down on a little bit. And I don't know that the issue of medical marijuana is just an automatic free pass into, hey, well, this is totally okay, either. And so I would want, well, hopefully people are parts of churches where people are involved in each other's lives and they know what's going on. And things are done with accountability and encouragement and help along the way. And I would hope that's the case for any mind-altering substance that people are taking for medical purposes.
You've been listening to a very thought-provoking conversation with Todd Miles about his book, Cannabis and the Christian.
I have the munchies now. See what I did
what
there?
The Bible says about marijuana. Thanks again for listening to the Steps of Church Leaders podcast. You can find more interviews as well as other great content from ministry at ChurchLeaders.com. And we found our conversation helpful today. We'd love for you to take a few moments to leave us a review at Apple Podcasts. That'll help other ministry leaders find us more easily. You can find other great Christian podcasts on the Faith Play app, available for both Apple and Android. We'll see you in the next episode.
You've been listening to the Stetzer Church Leaders podcast. For more great interviews, as well as articles, videos, and free resources, visit our website at ChurchLeaders.com. Thanks for listening.